Welcome to chapter 16, the final chapter in our text. And chapter 16 pretty much serves as a wrap up and a high level overview of not only the entire course, but of what to expect moving forward in the future. Specifically, we're going to talk about globalization, we're going to talk about corporate enterprise crime, we're going to talk a little bit about green crime and cyber crime, transnational crime. We're going to talk about the impact terrorism has on the criminal justice system, and we're going to talk about future or trends that will influence the entire system moving forward. Globalization primarily refers to economies, politics, and even sometimes legal systems. The more we have become interconnected as a world in terms of communication and trade, the more we have been exposed to each other's long-standing traditions and customs in all facets of life, which has impacted the way that all countries do business on a regular basis. Um, Globalization really took off with the fall of the Soviet Union. So the concepts of individual exceptionalism from one country to the next really were kind of set to the wayside, and the ability to develop global economies was seen. Some of the biggest examples of that is with the fall of the Soviet Union and the nation of Ukraine. As a country trying to stand up on its own 2 feet and become self sufficient, we, as the United States, taught them agriculture. There is just as much wheat grown in Ukraine as there is in the United States, which obviously has had an impact on our agricultural markets today. Some people tend to believe that the process of globalization will improve standards of living worldwide, and others see opportunities for criminal enterprises to exploit new markets. Um, Government doesn't react to new endeavors quickly. They have to understand it, they have to see its full impact, and then identify the dangers. And by the time that that's occurred, um, someone has already been exploited by that point. In other words, there's never really been a system or new system of trade developed in which criminal enterprises haven't already leveraged that to their own advantage before government's even aware that it's a problem. Globalization is primarily impacted by technology and by culture. The foreign nations that we regularly trade with and work with on a regular basis, that's all done through the advance of technology and our better ability to communicate openly with them, which brings about an exposure to different cultures. Corporate crime is not something that is in my professional wheelhouse as a county sheriff, but it certainly has the potential to be devastating to millions of Americans on a regular basis. This relates to fraud that occurs on Wall Street, such as Ponzi schemes, subprime mortgages. In in between 2006 and 2010, subprime mortgages became a constant topic of conversation in which banks were letting out essentially what were known as predatory loans, allowing people with inappropriate credit or inappropriate incomes to borrow money for a home much larger than what they could actually afford, which caused them at one point to end up upside down in their mortgages and caused them to lose their homes through foreclosure, which had a debilitating effect not only on the housing market but on those individual scams or on those individual families. Of course, when crises like that occur, scams usually show up at the same time. There were a ton of foreclosure rescue scams. Trust us with your money, we can help you save your home, etc. When in fact, there was no way out of foreclosure, costing those families to lose even more money. Multi-billion dollar funds are subject to fraud because these funds are so big that the ability to siphon out of those funds without anybody being any the wiser is just, I mean, the bigger the pot, the easier it is to take smaller amounts out of them. When we're combating corporate enterprise crime, we're primarily talking about civil law and not criminal law because there's no typically there's no physical harm done. It's usually the harm that occurs is done at the corporate level and not always at the individual level. We're certainly not talking about our average American who isn't likely invested into the major markets. So this involves civil enterprises. The FBI has a function within some civil law, and a lot of attorneys general for each state will have an opportunity to come in and fine companies when they've been defrauding the public. The big agency responsible for investigating these types of crimes, however, is the Securities Exchange Commission, and they have agents and offices near every major market. That's not just New York. That's not just Wall Street. That's any place where there is an exchange system. So the Chicago Board of Trade, the Kansas City Ag Board, etc. You will find SEC agents in place monitoring these trading companies. Green crime. Here we're talking solely about the environment. There have been numerous laws passed essentially since the early 70s related to protecting our environment. They relate to regulating logging, regulating fishing, and pollution, essentially to protect our natural resources that many people have made a living off of, generationally have made a living off of, but it's now heavily regulated how those endeavors can be carried out. Some of the most notable pieces of legislation that have developed because of the topic of protecting our environment include the Clean Water Act, which is a controversial one, at least in the Midwest. Emergency planning and community right to know deals predominantly with manufacturing facilities in the presence of dangerous chemicals. The Endangered Species Act, which is something that most game wardens are intimately familiar with. And then, of course, the Oil Pollution Act, which is a function of the EPA. Probably the fastest growing and most rapidly changing facet of crime relates to cybercrime. At a high level, we're talking about computer fraud. That's theft of information, email compromises, the deployment of ransomware. Payroll diversion is one that was recently deployed in Kansas. We saw several cases of payroll diversion. Software theft is something that you would typically see in Silicon Valley. And then, of course, corporate espionage at an extremely high level. Some of the things that local officers will encounter related to cybercrime are, of course, elder fraud occurs on a regular basis. Copyright infringement is typically a federal function. Identity theft is a tough one because while there are state statutes that outlaw the practice of identity theft, the mechanisms for enforcing that are tough because many times the perpetrators live either in a completely different state or in another country. Recent developments related to combating cybercrime relate to the distribution of pornography and even prostitution or human trafficking. In many cases, that's a dark web thing, but in the past year, the state of Kansas passed a law that required pornographic websites to verify the identification of anyone seeking to log in to their site, which meant at a practical level that anybody, well, let's use Pornhub as a website example, simply because it's one of the most notable ones, would require anyone logging into the Pornhub website to enter their date of birth and driver's license information to verify their identity and verify their age. The Constitution says we can't prevent people from examining pornography, but it does, based on Supreme Court cases, but it can restrict access to minors, and that was the function of this bill. The impact of that was simply for those major companies, such as Pornhub, to just take their websites down because they lacked the ability to not only collect massive amounts of data, but to protect that data as well. So they simply went out of business and forced it that way. Human trafficking remains a predominant problem. It's not something that is talked about in big circles, and it's not something that's simply a big city crime. This occurs nationwide. There are victims that are transported from one state to the next. They are typically immigrants. Not always, but most often they are immigrants who've been coyoted across the border and are forced to work off the cost of this through sex trafficking. Small towns are not immune. Hotels are extremely transient places, and if a room was legitimately rented for the night, it's usually not the hotel's business what occurs in those rooms. And before law enforcement's even made aware of it, these perpetrators and their victims have packed up and moved on to the next community. Tracking them requires a pretty intensive effort of online searches and manipulation to determine when and where these folks are going to show up next. And it's a very frustrating endeavor. Some of the federal agencies that work to combat this are often very frustrated at their inability to keep up with how fast these folks move. Transnational crime, given the current dialogue related to our border policies here in the United States, transnational crime has become a focus, and globalization has impacted this to a great extent. Transnational crime is simply impacted as the use of, or simply defined as the use of illegal tactics to gain profit in the global marketplace. So specifically, we're talking about narcotics trafficking, we're talking about human trafficking, and weapons trafficking. A lot of these transnational crime groups can be found in Russia, in China, in Mexico, and in Africa. They developed in Russia, again, with the fall of the Soviet Union. They had a crumbling economy, they had a struggling governmental system in place. And when you don't have solid controls in place to combat criminal activity, those criminal enterprises will step in and fill that gap. It's the same with China. In many communist countries, and in other communist countries as well, you will almost always find a very powerful criminal enterprise in place. Mexico has been a problem child for the United States for a long time with the cartels. Initially with the smuggling and the illegal importation of marijuana that transitioned to cocaine as partnerships were created with South America, and now as partnerships have been created with China with the illicit smuggling of fentanyl as well. Africa has always been an unstable region when it comes to crime and governmental control, and has always made itself ripe for transnational crime. Predominantly, though, the transnational crime efforts that we see in Africa relate to weapons trafficking in order for some of these organizations to gain political control, which almost makes them more terrorist organizations than criminal organizations. Which leads us to terrorism. Terrorism has reshaped and changed extensively law enforcement here in the United States since the September 11th attacks. I am someone who was at the police academy on 9/11. I remember sitting in the classroom having our class for the day interrupted so they could present the information to us about what had occurred related to the attacks, and almost instantly the manner in which we were trained changed to be always cognizant of terrorist attacks here in the United States. It may not be talked about as much within media circles because it's been a long time since we've suffered a terrible attack, but the threat still exists and has yet to subside worldwide. Terrorism is premeditated, politically motivated violence that's perpetrated by subnational groups or clandestine agents of governments against non-combatant targets. This is not a military fighting a military or a law enforcement agency combating a military group through an invasion, etc. These are either unofficially created organizations with a dedicated purpose, or it is agents of a government acting in a clandestine manner to hurt one nation or another. And typically the goal is to create instability in order to influence their desired form of change. Universal definitions of what terrorism actually is difficult because we all have a separate criminal code and we all have a separate justice system. The United Nations has worked hard to come up with a universal definition that allows countries to work together more freely to combat it. But as countries correctly choose to leverage their sovereignty, it makes it more difficult to really highlight that stuff down. Terrorism activities typically focus on retribution. They do dabble in the weapons trade, the human trafficking trade, and even the narcotics trade to fund their operations. But the bigger goal is typically political control through force. Our U.S. court system has defined terrorism in two different ways. And the first category involves violating federal statutes related to terror, of which there are many. And then the second category includes lesser violations such as fraud, immigration issues, firearms issues, perjury, and many, many others. There is a bigger focus on category 2 at the practical level than there is category 1 because of the argument that exists that if we are combating terrorism by imprisoning terrorist actors for fraud, for immigration violations, etc., then we're not investigating an attack after the fact, which means we're preventing harm from being done. The justice system has had a difficult time with terrorism. It's one thing to go practically combat it. It is another thing to bring it into the court system and adequately deal with it. Most terrorism cases are heard in the federal courts, even though many states have statutes related to it. And the reason for that is because the federal government has broad authority during an emergency to set aside specific protections related to the Constitution and to set aside specific liberties that we're used to, such as the right to privacy. It's why at times we may see the TSA at airports ramp up their screening procedures, and there's no ability to challenge their authority to do that because based upon a threat, they're typically granted the authority to do those things. There are concerns related to ensuring that due process exists, even for non-citizens, just simply because we are a nation that's founded on laws, even though we were initially founded on biblical principles, now we operate in a secular fashion today based on legal process. And because we are that country, there is an argument that we should ensure that even non-citizens are afforded those same opportunities. I can imagine that all of us might have different or varying opinions on that, and so I won't chase that rabbit hole. One practical concern that has aggravated concerns related to terrorist threats is our open border policies. The greater access that foreign terrorist actors have to get into the country, the easier it is for them to carry out some form of an attack. And year after year, our border agents provide stats that show how many terrorist actors they believe actually got into the country. Determining the appropriate court is sometimes a challenge. There were many U.S. Supreme Court cases, and they're listed within the chapter, that relate to our initial attacks in the Middle East as retribution for the attacks on September 11th and our desire to dismantle these terrorist organizations. Well, what do we do with these folks that we've captured? Do they belong in the U.S. federal court system? Do they belong in front of military tribunals? That's been a difficult question to answer that, to a certain extent, hasn't been fully fleshed out and is still challenged from time to time. Shifting from what we face now to what we think we're going to face in the future, there are several things that influence our ability to adapt to new trends. The first one is a demographic shift. Our census studies show that we are an aging population. An aging population means that we're going to see more criminal actors age out of crime. As people become older, they become less violent. It doesn't mean that the dangers are going to go away, but we should begin at some point to see regular reductions within our prison rates and even to a certain extent violent crimes that are brought before the courts. As technology continues to advance, it improves our lives on a daily basis, but it also opens up other opportunities for criminal enterprises to step in and to harm folks either personally or financially. Those advancements both help and hinder law enforcement operations because law enforcement, unlike criminal enterprises, have an obligation to comply with the restrictions in the Constitution. It is not uncommon to find, even in the smallest of agencies, devices attached to computers that are designed to download cell phone data. We all work off of smartphones. There is a ton of data contained within each and every one of those. And the quicker we can access that, the quicker we can fully flesh out the extent of the damage that's occurred when a crime has been committed. However, as I've mentioned in previous lectures, I think all the way back in maybe module 2, um, we can get a warrant to seize a phone, but we have to get a second warrant to look at the data inside the phone. And specifically, we have to explain what it is that we're looking for within that phone and why. And many times the courts will make us use those cell phone dumping systems to limit the scope of our search to ensure that we're still respecting expectations of privacy. Immigration practices that have existed over the last 20 years have held the potential to drastically change the demographics of a community. Garden City, Kansas is a perfect example of this. Garden City became a hub for refugees in the late 90s and in the early 2000s, particularly out of Somalia. There is an enormous Somali community in Garden City that's not going anywhere. And the more that it grows, the more we can begin to see those communities change. Dodge City, Kansas is another example. In a community that you might anticipate being one that's predominantly containing white people as well as Hispanics, now has Vietnamese, and some of the Somali community has begun to spill over into Dodge City. As these cultures come to the United States as refugees, they're provided an opportunity to become United States citizens. However, many of these foreign communities that are brought here as refugees fail or refuse to assimilate to an American culture, which changes the way that we have to react with the public pretty drastically. Evidence-based justice practices are gaining popularity on a regular basis, and it's gaining public support. This requires agencies and systems to focus on what is working instead of holding to or clinging to traditional norms, which means we have to become more flexible and adaptable as a criminal justice system in order to continue to meet current demands. That's going to require extensive and ongoing scientific studies related to practices. Recessions drive budgets down, at least for local governments at the county and the city level. The tougher the recession is, the harder it is for local governments to build income, which means that we can sometimes see downsizing of criminal justice agencies because of their local government's inability to appropriately fund it. But that doesn't change the demand for law enforcement services. So we have to get better at doing more with less. That means adapting technology to our regular uses. The implementation of technology such as license plate reading cameras help with that. And any kind of tool that we can use as a force multiplier is a benefit. But we've got to get better at doing more with less. Globalization is a continuing trend. I don't see that it's going anywhere at all. That challenges not only political boundaries, but it challenges individualism and exceptionalism at the national level. We have an identity as Americans that is constantly shifting in how we perceive ourselves and how the rest of the world perceives us. And globalization is going to continue to change that perception and definition over time. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about pandemics. Even though on a daily basis, COVID-19 doesn't impact our lives anymore, the long-term impact that the pandemic had, both on our economy, on our mental health systems, and on our criminal justice systems, has yet to be fully measured. And it's my belief that it's probably another 10 years before we can fully measure that impact and make decisions about how best to change. This is that topic, not the pandemic, but what we expect to see in the future is one of the biggest reasons that I still love this career field, because we're constantly adapting and changing. We're constantly shifting to meet the needs of the public that we serve. And while we don't necessarily know what the future entails, we know that if we can remain focused on meeting the needs of the public, we know we're going to be better positioned to do that in the best way possible. So this is the last chapter of our book. I'm going to ask you to complete a discussion post related to Chapter 16. And I'm also going to ask you to take a final quiz that incorporates just chapters 15 and 16. And then I'm going to get out of your way. I've combined these two chapters together in 1 week to give you the time you need to start working on your paper. Throughout our text, in every module, has been several Supreme Court cases that have been brought up. I'm asking you to simply pick one Supreme Court case that has an impact on the criminal justice system. Not It does not have to be a case that's listed in the text, but I need you to incorporate how it's impacted law enforcement operations, how it's impacted court systems, how it's impacted corrections, etc. It needs to be a case that isn't specifically pointed, but that is broadly impactful. And so, as you're completing this module out, I want you to be thinking about what that topic may be.